This is the Burn the Turf Competitive Debating Podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Wu. The BTT Podcast is a place where we're going to talk about everything to do with competitive debating. On the show, expect to see discussions about tournaments, motion, strategy, and highlighting the skills and achievements of top debaters on the scene. We'll also be bringing in special guests for each episode, and with us today we have a longtime debater and Cusid finalist, Elizabeth Lee. Welcome, it's great to have you here.
Thanks, Joseph. Thanks for having me on.
Cool. So, let's start with a little bit of introduction about you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you get started, how long you've been debating.
Yeah, sure. Hey, I'm Elizabeth, Liz. I'm a rising grade 12 student at Branksome Hall, which also makes me feel a little bit old, but that's okay. I've been debating for about 2.5 years now, and I started in the winter of grade 9, although I didn't start debating seriously until grade 9 summer during COVID-19. And the way I got started and the reason I started debating, it's actually when my partner, Hao, made a Discord server during the summer that we would later call 6 a.m. Gang. And in the server, we started to get a lot of other debaters in a year to join. We talked a lot. We ran a bunch of practice rounds. So I think that was really good for creating a sense of community that was mostly wholesome, though somewhat unwholesome at times. And yeah, that just helped sustain my interest, and it was a really good avenue for me to get experience and to hear from older, more experienced debaters at the time.
Cool, that sounds really, really cool. And just a little bit about me, because I realize I haven't introduced myself at all. I currently am I'm going to third year at McGill, study political science and math. I have been debating for 6 years now, since late grade 9, and I started really seriously debating in grade 11 and grade 12. So I've been seriously debating for about 4 years now. I've been around the high school circuit a lot, and I do a good amount of coaching now, which is why I'm still involved. So yeah, how did you feel as someone who got started in debating in COVID? How was the experience maybe striking or different to how you would imagine it in person?
I feel like I might be one of the few debaters who say this, but I think I actually really enjoyed debating during COVID because as someone who was a lot more shy going into debate, I think it would have been a lot more intimidating if I started debating in person and just was thrown into in-person tournaments. And there's a lot of advantages to debating online, right? You can wake up. You can wake up a lot later to go to these tournaments. I type faster, way faster than I write my notes, which I think it's also going to be hard to adjust to in-person, writing notes as well. And also just have a lot more prep time. I also have a terrible sense of direction, so I would get very lost if I had to find my room in person. So this also saves time letting me prep and write notes, which I think is quite nice.
Yeah, in person, basically if you're on opening government, you will need to spend at least 8 to 9 minutes finding a room, unless if you're right next to the GA or debating in the GA. So it is a big nerf to opening government when you are in person for sure. But yeah, that sounds actually really cool. I remember my first debate, I was super nervous. It was in front of 8 of my classmates, right? And I'm still nervous debating, standing there in front of people, speaking out loud. And I feel like it is definitely a lot more approachable. It's more approachable, maybe less fun online, but that's the trade-off there, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, what would you say is your best debating experience so far?
Ooh, okay. This is ironic because I just talked about how much I liked online debating, but it was probably, I think, near the winter or maybe in March. There's a Worlds tournament called IDTL where me and my teammates, it was Andrew Shi, Andrew Liu, Sherry, David, and myself. We actually got together and debated together in person. Oh. And the vibe was just immaculate. We could chat in between rounds. We played Smash on the Switch. It actually felt a lot better than just calling your partner over Discord or something. And that was quite wholesome.
Yeah, I can imagine. That sounds so fun. It's it's almost you are debating in person, just not against the other team, which is you don't need the other team anyways. That sounds so fun. Alrighty. Now with that wholesome introduction out of the way, the first thing we're going to talk about is from this point in August, we've got about basically a week left until the official new school year starts. And what that means is we have all of our retiring or leaving grade 12s out of the circuit, and then we basically have a completely new season of competitive debating. So I've got a list of a few of the names of the really competitive debaters who are graduating this year. It's a pretty long list. Shout outs to everyone for having a really long and successful and fruitful career. So leaving this year are Stellar, Michael, Max, Vincent, Alex, Annie, Claire, Larissa, Tyra, Alex, Zoo, David, Zoo, Stu, Dylan, and Sherry. So a lot of people who have been to a lot of tournaments in the last year, who I've enjoyed watching and getting to know, they will be gone for next year. As someone who's going to be in the circuit next year, how do you feel, or what do you think it means for the circuit for all of these really, really strong debaters to be leaving?
In terms of how I feel, this actually makes me quite sad, which is a little bit irrational considering this is technically good for me because they were all incredibly good. But like, I'll kind of miss just having them around. Like, Sherry was lovely. She's also my neighbor, so I love her. Like David and Alex, we were in the same class for a long time. Stella and Michael were probably people I looked up to a lot when I was first starting to debate and learning how debate works. And I think it was just really nice seeing all of them in the circuit and just feeling like it was really terrifying going in is obviously terrifying, but it was also really nice in a very strange masochistic way. So yeah, like I think I'll miss the fact that they're all leaving. In terms of the circuit, I feel like there's a really interesting change in the circuit where with all like the top debaters leaving, it's like sort of like a wealth inequality analogy, where the skill is like less concentrated at the top, but I think in recent years, maybe partially because a lot of debaters started debating and learning to debate during COVID, there's a lot more really, really strong debaters concentrated in like the middle because of how accessible debate resources have been, how accessible tournaments have been, and all of these things.
Yeah, for sure. Especially, I think on top of that, a lot of the coaching, a lot of like the communities. Before you would be more or less just restricted to your club or your coaching class, but now that it's online, you have massive, massive groups of like dozens and dozens of people together all talking about and practicing debate together, which is really, really cool. And I think you're definitely right about the average skill getting a lot better and also it being a lot more concentrated at the top. Like every tournament, you see a ton of people who are debating really solidly all at the top, all competing for those few break spots, which gets really tight and really competitive. But it's really, really fun to watch and observe from the sidelines. If I were to ask you, I'll give you my thoughts on this after, but who would you be looking out for next year as like some of the top teams competing?
Ooh, okay, that's a good question. It's also a hard question because a lot of the people I know are either graduating or retiring.
Yeah.
But if I had to give some names, I'd say like Raleigh, obviously incredibly cracked. I don't know if he's going to be debating as often next year, given the fact that like the guy has enough achievements.
Yeah.
No, he has like, enough achievements for 5 lifetimes. But yeah, like if he debates, obviously incredibly terrifying. Tanish and Barry as well, although I think both of them aren't going to be as active in British parliamentary. But if they do go to tournaments, obviously incredibly good, very amazing debaters. Same with Maria, where she might still be relatively prevalent and will obviously be very difficult to debate against. Yeah, I'm just going through a list of names in my head now. Like Randy and Justin, they're both O5s. I also don't know if they'll be as active in BP, but they're probably going to do some like CSDF tournaments where they'll obviously do really well. Oh, and Grayson and or Angelina, they're both incredible debaters. They're both younger than me as well. And from my experience debating like with or against them, they're all like really talented and very amazing.
Yeah, for sure. I've seen a lot of them debate. They've been really, really solid this year and probably are going to continue to crush it next year. A few more that I got. I'm pretty sure Jin Jin partnered with Kevin at the round robin. So I'm pretty sure they're going to be at least a pretty strong team next year. Jin making finals at Cusid, which we'll talk more about. Kevin and Jin making finals at round robin against some really good teams too. Jin's been crushing it for a while now. I expect to see him be really solid next year as well. Yeah, we probably still have a really, really exciting circuit going on next year. Probably just as competitive, and probably going to see a lot of new names rising as well. So I'm really looking forward to that. I hope that all people out there are looking forward to that as well.
Thing to add on.
Yeah.
I just thought of like a list of a few more debaters that were like a little bit younger. Obviously, this is not all encompassing. These are just the people that come to mind at the very moment. I think Kaylee and Sarah, we were also in a class for a long time. They're really solid. They also did well at Queen's Summer. In fact, they won Queen's Summer, which is really amazing. So yeah, obviously doing really well. Jason and Julian, very, very cracked as well. Eric Yang, very nice kid, also incredible at debate, as well as World Schools.
Yeah, I think also one person I just thought of is Sophie Guangdong. She's like really, really solid on mechanisms. I've seen her debate a few times. I've judged her a few times, and I think she's really, really solid on a lot of the fundamentals, giving really, really fast, but like really good analysis too. I think that always helps for good debaters. So you've been around for 3 years, including 11, 10, and 9 at this point. You've been around for, I guess, 3 different year changes then, too. In your experience, what have the most striking year changes in recent history been?
That's also a good question. I think I was less familiar with my grade 9 year because I wasn't really active competitively. So I think you might have been around that year. It was with
Oh,
you,
yeah, that was
Max,
my year. That was my year.
RP. Yeah, I'm not as familiar with that year, but I can say in my grade 10 year, which was 2020, 2021, that year was just a lot more intimidating to me. I feel like in terms of the people at the very top, I perceive them to be really like a lot more difficult, but this might also be like biased because I was also a lot worse at the time. So yeah, like Gabby, Stella and Michael, who were more active that year, I feel that made that made the circuit feel a lot more intimidating. But I'd say going into the future years, it links back to what I said before, where I feel like a lot of younger generations had a lot more decent or really good debaters, which made it feel less like just the few top debaters winning all the tournaments and a lot more like there's a variety of debaters who are all doing very well, who are all very strong.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I can just talk briefly about my year. So my year was the 2019-2020 year. That was our last year in debate. And our year had a ton of really, really good and competitive people leaving. I'm pretty sure it's one of the, like, looking at this year's list, it's really, really long and really, really strong too. Our year's list was also, I think, really, really strong. Included like Max, Rosen, Rena, RP, Angela, and a lot more people who are like really, really good that I couldn't possibly name in this year. That year was probably a big shakeup, which honestly let a lot of people become a lot better the next year, right? It was really cool to watch people fill in the gaps. People like Rally and Maria really step up and become a lot better in those years. And it was really cool to watch.
Overall, I feel like the circuit has been relatively constant in many ways. It's just different people being at the top, but I think the relative feel of debating, although it got more accessible, has largely stayed the same, in my opinion at least.
I felt like the perception obviously changes as you become better, but I think the actual feel objectively stays somewhat consistent. So I'd agree with you on that. Alrighty, cool. So moving on from that, now we're going to talk a little bit about the Cusid High School tournament, which took place yesterday and the day before. Not sure when people are going to be watching it, either on the Monday or the Tuesday. But I'll just give a brief overview for the tournament. Tournament consisted of 5 rounds, break to quarterfinals, had a junior semifinals as well, had 70-something teams and a lot of really, really competitive teams there as well. And yeah, I'd consider it, I don't know, I have like kind of a classification system for like the tournaments and like their prestige and stuff. Like tournaments that have over 80 teams and like a lot, like a majority of the top teams debating there. This is borrowed from like Super Smash Bros. Melee. I call them like super majors, and then majors are like 60 plus teams. Yeah, 60 plus teams, several good, like a bunch of good teams there. And below that are just like minors, like smaller tournaments. So super majors for this year, I would probably consider like Queens, McGill. I don't know how many people UBC actually get, but it'd probably be the most competitive tournament on the West Coast for sure. UBC, McGill, Hart House, those are the big ones for this year. So moving forward, I'll definitely be watching out for those, probably be judging at them, and probably see a lot of people listening to this podcast there too as well. But for this tournament in specific, I first want to start off by congratulating Alex and Leo for winning the whole thing in what I thought was a very well debated final. We'll get to that momentarily. And I also wanted to highlight who I thought were pretty breakout debaters at this tournament. Previously, they had been doing fairly well with some junior breaks and speaking fairly well. But this time at Cusid, which is very prestigious tournament, we saw Jade Wang and Conan Lee make a run all the way into the finals. I'm pretty sure they haven't done anything to this level before, and watching them debate, they were debating extremely well. I think Jade had very, very solid cases, and also like set up for her cases, and really strong mechanisms to beat out other teams. Jade baited me really hard by saying she hard fourth in the semis, and I hear that she made it through into finals, and I was super happy for her. Conan as well, really solid and rather strategic seconds. Pretty good responses to things that we heard out of most of the other side. And yeah, it was really fun getting to see new debaters take advantage of this tournament. You must have hit them like one or two times, right, Liz?
Yeah, I think the most striking example is when we hit them in finals, which, as I mentioned before, I don't remember super vividly because I kind of erased it from my memory out of trauma. But I do recall they did quite well. I think their back half strategy was quite good in terms of finding out the nuances of what wasn't covered on opening, especially for us, like on opening opposition, they were closing. In terms of filling in analysis as to why. Okay, I think you're going to talk about this finals motion later, but let's just say that their analysis was really good and quite nuanced.
Yeah. Like when I started giving it, immediately struck me as a pretty good and well placed case in the round, even if it didn't end up winning. So one thing I wanted to ask you, just as an overview for the tournament, did you have like any general strategy as to what you prioritized in your speeches or as your team, or do you just kind of debate your best as always?
Obviously, debate my best as well.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing going into the tournament is, so I usually partner with Hal, who's my usual partner.
Yeah.
So this time I partnered with Andrew. So one of the things I wanted to focus on, given that this was someone I don't usually partner with, is being a lot more communicative during prep. Whereas with Hal and I, we often just talk a little bit at the beginning, then we just go off and write our own thing because we kind of can read each other's minds. It's like telepathy. Yeah, this time I made an active effort to work on like articulating my thought process out loud, being able to type or write the case while I'm explaining the case as well. So to improve prep cohesion, case cohesion as well. That's like one of the big things I wanted to keep in mind going into the tournaments.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. And yeah, that's definitely a really, really important skill to work on. Prep, like literally having a good prep versus having a bad prep is a huge gap, especially on opening and even closing teams. Being able to think of the important like perspectives or like pieces of characterization or like your strategy are really, really big on all teams pretty much. Yeah, cool. So at this point, let's move into a breakdown of some of the motions. For some things, I have additional comments to add. If I talk about any links or any like tournaments that are outside of this tournament, I'll probably be linking it in the description. So feel free to take a look there afterwards. But the first round of Cusid was, this house believes that social justice movement should prioritize local issues over international issues. So the first thing I wanted to ask you about this is, how did you feel about the motion? Did you like it? Not really like it? Think it was bad? Good?
I have strong thoughts about this motion.
You do?
I'm sorry,
you don't?
Cusid.
Okay, you do.
I do.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I think this is a motion that is hard to balance, from my opinion. Like, from my perspective, I think we got the best side, which is opening governments. And the case we ran was, I guess in its most simplified form, just talk about why there's greater capacity to create change in terms of proximity, politically. We talked about why trying to create international change is often harmful in terms of like interventionist mechanisms of large countries. And then we talked about why you just also get more support and buy-in because you have issues that are more proximate to you. And all of these just felt like independent paths to victory. If we prove more buy-in, that's contingent on creating change is contingent on buy-in. If we talked about capacity to create change, that's also like an independent path to victory. Thirdly, whether or not this change was good, also an independent path to victory. And all of these things felt like clashes that we would eventually win on. And for our team personally, we couldn't really think of the strongest op responses that would actually take down our case. So we left the round feeling like it was gov heavy. Perhaps you have different thoughts, but that's my opinion of the emotion, that it's probably easier to debate on prop, and op teams that succeed would probably succeed based on being more experienced debaters.
Yeah, so for round one, you always have to be a little bit careful looking at the stats. So what the stats say for this round is government is slightly favored, 1.58 to 1.42. And this probably speaks to your skill, but basically CG is OG is actually the worst position in this debate, and CG is the best. Yeah, OG has like 1.28, CG has 1.89. And when I say like 1 point whatever, right? Basically what that means is there are 6 points that are given out in any debate, and on average, each team receives 1.5, right? So this if a team gets 1.5, it's exactly average for that round. If they get above 1.5, they are better than average for the round. And if they get 2.0, it is like 33% easier to get points in that team compared to other teams. So in this case, it probably took a lot of, in most of the rooms, right? Because these stats come from all of the rooms. So that includes a lot of junior debaters that showed up to the tournament, a lot of less experienced debaters too. But definitely, I think you're right that government has a plethora of ways to win the debate, and it appears like a lot of the time opening government couldn't always think about all of the ways, or closing government generally had enough available to them to be able to win. Given that it's round one, it's also possible that a surplus of the good teams were put, or like the top tier teams were put on closing government, which probably warps the stats a little bit. I haven't looked through that yet. I think the ways that you identify you won were pretty good on government, especially. I think for opposition, it is definitely a bit more difficult. I do have a link that pulls up the last time I can recall this motion being run outside of Cusid, which was Queens High School 2019. And at that, that tournament was run in CP, so it was a 2v2 format instead of 2v2v2v2. It was actually perfectly balanced there, which probably speaks to the fact that it is a relatively balanced gov op motion. But I think as you get better, it becomes easier and easier to debate on government. But I think there definitely are some cases you can run reasonably well opposition. One thing that struck me is the extent to which you're able to actually get external support, or the extent to which your movement can be strong. And I think there's also an aspect that you can focus on that relates to where this actually applies. So if you're prioritizing local issues, I think there's some framing you can run about how the majority of social justice wealth probably exists in like more developed countries, and less of it exists in lesser developed countries. And what that means is you don't, if you focus on local issues, there's less likely to be a prioritization on that specific issue in the context of other countries, whereas the opposite probably has that happen more of the time. I do think there are ways to tackle the issue on government for sure, but that's one of the things you probably have an advantage on. And then the second thing is probably to do on a similar vein to do with funding, but it definitely is more difficult to run on opposition. I think it's not quite as clear what the benefit of local issues, which are more specific in nature, are compared to international issues. And any additional thoughts on that?
I think my first instinct is to try and debate you right now on the podcast because I am a debater.
Just tell me why my points are bad and wrong.
But yeah, like I think I just agree with your general comments that the motion probably seems balanced for a lot of debaters, but in terms of debating both sides at the peak, I think it does fall on the government a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with that one. Okay, cool. I don't think there's that much more to say about this motion, other than that probably it's strong at the peak level, unless if there's like a really good opposition case that neither of us are thinking about, and that a lot of people can actually access if they're a lot better. It's probably fairly gov leaning, but this is pretty, in terms of the stats at least, it's pretty good for a debate round in general. A lot more debate rounds will be a lot more egregious in their balance, and this is like mostly fine. It's like 1.3 on OG, 1.55 on OO, 1.9 on CG, which is a little bit high, and then 1.3 on CO. Yeah, that is that for round one. Round two, I think, is way more interesting. So I'll read out the info slide for round two, and then I'll read out the motion. So the info slide is, in a fee-for-service system, doctors bill provincial health insurance providers and receive the appropriate fee for the service they provide. Meanwhile, the capitation system is one in which doctors sign on and become responsible for a set of patients. These doctors receive a fixed salary scaled to the expectation of how often their patients will use their services. For example, they will be paid higher for doctors that take on older or pregnant patients. So basically, the motion is this house prefers capitation over the fee-for-service system, which means that like government basically wants people to sign on patients and be paid for how often they're expected to use it, for basically the identity of the patient and what issues they may have. And the fee-for-service is status quo, where doctors are just paid based on serving patients more or less. Thoughts on this motion?
I quite like this motion, actually. It reminds me of a lot of other motions that apply to like specifically the United States healthcare system in terms of nationalizing healthcare. I think a lot of analysis is cross-applicable. But there is like a few unique aspects of this motion that I think make it interesting to debate. The first is the idea that this salary is scaled proportionally on proposition. So I think both teams have to really focus on proving a margin and being comparative in this case. The other thing is that this is more prevalent in my round, where it was a big issue in terms of characterizing the interests of doctors. Do you mostly care about money? Do you have external reasons to be a doctor, like perhaps you actually care about saving lives? Wow. And whether or not they face accountability mechanisms. This is all quite important to the debate. And yeah, I think these are the two broadly quite important things to prove for all sides.
Yeah, you covered that pretty well. I think this motion is really cool as well. I have not seen a motion like this before. Maybe it's come up at some point, but definitely really, really cool and interesting motion. I think to me, it feels like there's no inherent advantage other than the fact that closing does a reasonable amount better than opening, because it's relatively difficult to think of like the really, really good arguments. I heard some really interesting cases in the round that I watched. So one of the cases I heard on opposition or closing opposition is just that it's going to be very, very difficult to be able to switch doctors, and it's going to be difficult to access doctors under a capitation system. And the reason why that's the case is because doctors will be wanting to sign a certain list of high value patients because that is their livelihood, that is their money pretty much. And they will be unlikely to want to sign out future patients, right? So they would be likely to very quickly get their list of patients, sign a bunch of high value patients, and then not really take any more. So for example, if you're an immigrant to the country without that much medical records and stuff, or you are just someone who is leaving your parents' insurance and you enter a community, you'll probably have a hard time finding a new doctor or a doctor who's willing to sign you because they already have a list of clients. Sure, people might die. Sure, people might leave. But given the time lag that would probably exist between you moving somewhere and then someone getting a spot, you would probably have quite a difficult time accessing healthcare when you really need it, right? And that's comparatively better in the fee-for-service system because the result of a new person entering the system and signing to see a doctor or just visiting the clinic to see a doctor is just that it gets a little bit more busy for everyone, right? So the harm is like more evenly distributed. You still get your healthcare. Everyone just waits a little bit longer. And that is probably comparatively better. And then the second thing on that idea is that people would have a hard time switching. So if you think your doctor is not listening to you properly or not understanding or not giving you proper treatment, you would have a lot more difficult time switching or getting a second opinion because clinics and their doctors would all have people who they see already. And this is particularly bad with specialists, for example, who are likely to sign off a specific list of relatively rich patients who are likely to want, likely to be able to be relatively high value because they can afford these services, they can pay more out of pocket, they'd be more likely to see the specialist for these problems, or for whatever reason, the specialists are probably going to be fairly booked up as well. So if you needed to see a psychiatrist or you needed to see a dermatologist, it might be more difficult to try to access those as well. That's one of the cases I heard out of closing opposition. I thought it was really cool. And then out of government, were you government or you were opposition on this side? Or on this debate?
We were closing government.
You were closing government. And how did that feel, debating on closing government?
Yeah, I would agree with the statement you said earlier. I am really glad they were not opening government because I think there's a lot of nuance to this motion that you don't see in a lot of like standard should we nationalize healthcare motions that would take a lot of time to just think through a little bit more deeply. Mm-hmm. In terms of closing government, we actually talked a lot about the things that you just talked about, but from the other perspective, right? Mm-hmm. So in terms of doctors being more choosy in terms of the patients they take on, the direction we took this in closing government was we said this actually gave doctors on opposition the incentive to discriminate against lower income patients because they were projected to be less capable of continuing service in the long term. So we would talk about why there's still often out-of-pocket fees that you have to pay for like prescription pills. Mm-hmm. There are some places with services that aren't covered by insurance. And what this means in opposition is doctors are less willing to take on patients who aren't able to pay these out-of-pocket fees into the long term. So when they stop treatment, they also don't get a salary. The comparative is when you get like a yearly or quarterly salary, whether or not they keep coming back. So you have more confidence in taking on these lower income patients. So that's the direction we took that on. We also talked about specialization, like funnily enough. So on closing government, we said we get more people being referred to specialists because so people start oftentimes by seeing their family doctor for their treatments or to diagnose issues. Then oftentimes the family doctor refers them to specialists. On our side, these doctors are more likely to refer them because they can still get their wage. On opposition, they're more likely to prescribe like short-term solutions like perhaps painkillers to continue reaping the benefits of getting them coming in for more treatments.
Oh wow, that's pretty sinister. That's a pretty sinister claim about doctors, I'm not gonna lie.
That's true. That's why I'm saying the other team should have characterized doctors a lot more. Would have helped.
Yeah, yeah. If you just say that, like, that probably violates the Hippocratic Oath to get more profit out of assigning painkillers, I'm pretty sure a judge would believe that. But maybe you need to explain a little bit more.
Mm. I think it's also like you can probably characterize it more nuanced on terms of like directly misdiagnosing or giving the wrong treatments, but rather subtly maybe omitting better treatments or omitting things like early referrals when you first see an issue arise.
Yeah. Yeah, like subtle things that you probably wouldn't be able to include. You can probably show that you can probably characterize that doctors. Okay, it might be a little bit more difficult to characterize that doctors are slimy people, but like they still went to residency, did all their stuff, and like the thing that gets you through that arguably is the money at the end. If you're just doing it because it's something that you like and you care for, there are probably other ways that you could do that. But there are probably also other ways you can make for money. So you can probably argue either side of the coin there, and it would be fairly reasonable, I think.
You're probably also like hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt after med school.
Oh yeah, they probably have a lot of pressure on their shoulders financially too. Yeah, I forgot about that. That's the benefit of not going into medicine.
True.
Yeah. All right. Any last thoughts on that motion? Or otherwise, we'll go to the next one.
Not particularly. I think we've covered everything.
Yeah, cool. All right, next one. I think this one is an interesting take on climate change. So the motion is: this House prefers a world in which parents in developed nations teach their children that climate change is caused by structural factors and large actors, for example, corporations, collective action problems, capitalism, etc., rather than teaching their children about personal responsibility and agency in fighting climate change, i.e., reducing car use, food waste, etc. So, what are your first thoughts on the motion? Do you like it? What side did you end up debating?
I like this motion. And I realized in retrospect, wait, Joseph, did you spectate my round for this one?
I did. I did spectate this round. I remember
Yeah,
this round.
so
I remember this
fun
round.
fact about this round. Andrew and I misread the motion.
Oh, what did you read? Oh, that's why you ran that case. Okay. What did you read it as?
So we only missed we missed like 3 letters in the motion. So we read developed as developing.
Oh, you thought it was only developing?
Yeah, I don't know why we both just collectively agreed it was developing nations. Like this wasn't something we both explicitly stated. We just sort of simultaneously ended silent prep and both assumed it was developing nations.
Oh, yeah, that is rather unfortunate.
Yeah, I think Alex even pointed it out in a POI. He was our we were OO, he was our CG.
Yeah,
he pointed out in a POI like really nicely. It was like, I know this sucks, but the motion says developed nations, not developing. And I just well, I wasn't speaking, thank God. It was Andrew, so he had to suffer the consequences.
It was Andrew speaking? Yeah, he pointed out in second because he let you guys babble about the wrong motion for 10 minutes.
No, I think he gave me a POI, but I asked for it verbally, but he gave them all in chat, so I didn't see them. So to his credit, he was being like a cool, honorable debater. Probably would have POI'd it first.
Yeah. Yeah, no, when I was listening to the case, I wasn't... So, you want to tell people what you actually ran?
Okay. I'll pull up my documents from yesterday, well, 2 days ago. I think a lot of analysis still does apply. There is content broadly about why advocating for structural change is incredibly difficult. Some of the cross-applicable analysis in developed context as well is the idea of corporate lobbying making it really difficult to create change. Although we did spend an unfortunate amount of time characterizing the context of developing countries, how they have a lot of need for economic development, why that's always going to be the priority for people within these nations. I think this is still applicable in some extent to developed countries, where you can say people still are a lot more selfish, they care a lot more about their economic incentives. Of course, Alex does flip this eventually, but I think it's still somewhat applicable. Then we extended this point to say why this improves long-term engagement with the movement as well. In terms of like when you feel like you're able to create some change, you're more motivated to keep engaging with the movement, as opposed to when you feel like structural change is impossible or hopeless, you're more willing to check out of the movement. Then we do some basic impacting of like marginal change. If you clean up your local neighborhood, your quality of life gets better. If you do like beach cleanups, there's less microplastics in the ocean. Just do some like marginal impacting. And the final thing we said, which I don't think actually factored into the RFD, which makes me a bit sad, is the idea of how we create more demand for structural change in the long term. And the way we characterized this was when you install values in your children to demand things like walking instead of driving cars, like when you demand things like recycling, this also pressures, like for example, urban developers to design cities in a way that makes that's less car dependent. Perhaps it pressures the governments to put more funding into transit because there's more demand for transit. When there's more like demand for recycling, you have better like recycling systems within the country. I think CO expands on this. Yes, CO expands on this when they talk about demand for vegan products. But largely it was just the idea that when you demand these types of structural change naturally in your everyday life, they also naturally get implemented without explicitly being campaigned for.
Right, yeah. I remember listening to the speech and hearing you go full numtot on the like the urban development part. I thought it was actually a really cool part of the case. I think that it was, and I think that it was engaged like reasonably with on the government side, and it wasn't factored into the RFD. But Ethan already was talking about almost everything in the RFD, so I don't like blame him. I think that there's probably some more marginal impact, but in my opinion, at least, I don't think it changes your placement over some of the other teams. Though it is like kind of comparable to the stuff that closing ended up running. What I will say about how I interpret your case at the start is I was listening to this on like literally on a car, and what I was trying to understand your case as, to your like benefit of the doubt, is I thought you were saying that people in developed nations would act in ways that also help developing countries. I thought that's how you were impacting it. I wasn't exactly sure how, because I was thinking about the developed nations context. But now that I realize that you guys actually weren't, like you just were straight up misread the motion, it is a little bit more awkward to interpret it that way. But anywho, I think that I'm actually surprised to see that. Actually, no, I'm not that surprised to see that it's so heavily leaned towards opposition, because I think that as you mentioned, it is much easier to show that people are going to do things as a result of personal responsibility. Like that is almost a guaranteed impact that you're going to have. It is almost guaranteed that people are going to reduce their food waste, they're going to reduce their car use, etc. What is, I think, much more difficult to show is why there's a likely chance that you're actually going to be able to get structural change. And I think Alex and Leo do a very good job of doing this in your room, when they say, look, people vote. Here are 5 reasons why people vote and are likely to vote in ways that are able to keep companies accountable. And then they also explained why it's particularly beneficial in comparison to be able to regulate corporations, reduce the amount of carbon they can emit, reduce the amount of pollution they can emit. All these things are really important, and if you can prove that, you pretty much win, right? Like you pretty much win the debate if you can show that you can actually hold corporations to account, even if it's not fully. As long as you get a reasonable increase, it is going to be at a much larger scale than you can, even with a ton of people engaging in personal responsibility. Anything to add on that?
Yeah, I also like, out of the CG case, Leo and Alex's case, is when they link economic interests to climate change interests. When you talk about perhaps, I'm forgetting the specific examples. I think one of them was agriculture, maybe the idea of people's houses going underwater, maybe not to that extent, but something along those lines. And why those are also like proximate economic interests that apply to people that are linked to climate change, which I think pretty easily defeats any op argument about why people are selfish and they care more about money. You link the two, so it's easier in closing gov.
Yeah, exactly. And like the answer in the real world is that there's basically some cognitive dissonance about the actual environmental harms and reality. Like you'll see on like news sources, I'm on Reddit a lot, so you every article that says, "Wow, this has been the hottest like week and a half in this country," and it's like for all of the countries over the course of a summer, and people will be like, "Wow, it's almost like we've never seen this happen." And there are a lot of people which are genuinely surprised, and even like I more or less have accepted it at this point, but there are a lot of people who just don't understand that it is just getting worse and worse year over year, and that's going to have real consequences like greater heat waves, more droughts, stuff like that. Even in like these are the effects that happen in largely more northern and developed countries. You can imagine how much worse it is in lesser developed countries right now as well. But in terms of the mechanism, that mechanism is pretty good. It's pretty hard to come up with that and also explain it reasonably well in a way that defeats that defeats that mechanism. So yeah, I'll comment briefly on the stats. O is really good, and I'm pretty sure O in a lot of the rounds are just saying that like, look, you can actually do you can use cars less, you can become vegan, you can have less food waste. These are all things that are very good. You can drive an electric car. You can not support companies which are harmful to the environment. You just say all those things, and a lot of times you win the round because what is government going to say? A lot of the time they're not going to prove why you're going to get actual change. You just refute that part pretty well, and then your closing, well, there's not that much more that your closing can add. Yeah, and that's how I kind of see a lot of the rounds breaking down. It's pretty difficult on Gov. It looks like most of the calls were just OOCO, OG, then CG in that order, but with a little bit more diversity on CG because some of the teams were able to pull ahead and take first or second depending on how big brain of a case they could come up with. Cool. Yeah, I think that covers a lot of the aspects of that debate. If you've got nothing else to add, let's go on to the next motion, which is round 4. This House believes that emerging democracies should suppress domestic media providers in favor of international media providers. I don't believe I was in your round for this one, so how did this one go for you?
Round 4. What happened round 4? It's all a blur now.
It's one of the most balanced motions
yes.
here. Yeah.
I think we also won this round where we were CO for this, and we basically just talked about why there's going to be a lot of democratic instability, like authoritarian backsliding because of the perception of censorship. And I think one of the more important contributions out of our case is giving a better characterization about the people within these emerging democracies. So it's just framing about why, like the fact that these are emerging democracies suggests that they were previously authoritarian or it's dictatorial in some sense, that people gained this freedom by agitating for it, usually with violence. And this suggests that people who are willing to do this and risk their lives probably care really deeply about their democratic values, about not being censored, about having freedom and liberty. And that's why there's going to be such a strong reaction to the perception of censorship. Well, not the perception, like actual censorship.
It is censorship, right? Like it's real censorship.
Actual censorship. So yeah. The other thing we said is that a lot of developing countries tend to have strong anti-Western beliefs within their people, whether due to historical colonialism, neo-colonialism, or just like being culturally opposed for religious reasons. So this was a wash. This was attempted. This is a wash for the OG argument, where OG says they give a bunch of reasons as to why citizens accessing this Western media is good. So this was strategically important because this proves that people were less willing to access this media because of their personal biases or personal feelings.
Yeah, because of their experiences, right? Because they've probably gone through some kind of coup or some kind of war against their old dictatorial government. Yeah, that's definitely pretty important to characterize the stuff that you talked about. In addition, I think it's also fairly. I don't know if this was contentious. Was it contentious in your round that domestic media would it be generally pro-government or you're pro-government or like anti-government, or like what did you guys imagine it being?
I think the round agreed it would tend to lean more pro-government. This was more of a clash on opening half as to why domestic media was good. This was supposed to be my second theme after proving why like there would be civil unrest and why this was the most important impact. And you might have noticed a problem with my time splits this round. I didn't have a chance to flesh out the second theme as to why domestic media was better. But yeah, I think what we said in terms of our case across our two speeches overall is we attempted to flip the idea about better resources for investigative journalism by saying that investigative journalists would either be more willing, like local investigative journalists would be more willing to work with local news sources as opposed to news sources from the West, and saying that Western news sources oftentimes just stigmatize locals, they don't trust locals, perhaps they perceive them as incompetent, perhaps they sketch a response. I think we got away with it though. And the final thing was just a mitigation by bringing back your characterization about why these citizens care about democracy. This probably gives the state and the government some incentives to create the perception of legitimacy, and that's why they're going to allow an opposition to be prominent and allow opposing viewpoints to go relatively unchecked within the political sphere or within media.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that also one more thing you could say about your sketchy response is that I think you can also just say that the news sources or the people themselves who you'd be working with are more likely to work with domestic news sources compared to international media providers, right? Instead, for the same reasons that you gave before, right? They basically don't trust international media sources for the host of reasons you already gave. Yeah. I think that generally covers a lot about this motion. It was very balanced, actually. One of the most balanced motions I've seen, at least at this tournament, is round 4. So the results are pretty valuable. One thing I will say is that for the round that I watched, it seemed to be a much better idea to focus on. I guess it's one of the rounds that you should focus more on big incentive analysis and what is likely to happen rather than talking about specific examples, because they can lean certain ways in different countries. But I think specific examples here are probably still good to add, but you really need to focus on what are the incentives of the governments, what are the incentives of people, what are the incentives of media providers. All those things are very, very important to discuss and kind of establish, because if you don't establish that in a way that's good for your case and someone else does it, you are going to lose. So it sounds like you guys did a really good job of that in your round, which is probably why you won.
Okay, yeah, so I just talked a lot about our case from closing opposition, and I haven't really thought about the other side beyond basic concepts like better accountability and more resources so citizens get more accurate information. What is your conception of the best gov case?
Yeah, so I think that the best gov case you can run is very closely tied to things about democratic backsliding. So firstly, you would want to characterize that domestic media providers or domestic media sources are actually very likely to be still kind of corrupt, or at least still kind of having ties with the old government. And the reason why that's the case is because media companies don't come out of nowhere. Media companies probably still existed in the dictatorship. They were probably state-owned or state-influenced, right? But now they're newly independent. They still have relatively similar power structures with relatively similar people running them, which makes it very likely that they're going to say things that are, very likely that they're going to say things that are in support of the probably previous dictatorial government or whoever that group of people back. And it's not just a given that emerging democracies just become good democracies. It's actually very, very difficult for countries to make that leap. There are countries that have been in this kind of emerging democracy state for many decades and still haven't really become free and fair in terms of their media and their elections. It's it's a sliding scale, right? It's half free, half fair, that kind of stuff. So what you probably argue on either government team is that you should suppress this in order to just straight up reduce the very powerful influence that the old dictatorial government can have, who has an incentive to undermine your democratic government. You don't have to show that it's going to go back into a dictatorship. You just have to show that it's going to stay an emerging democracy and that it is going to stay relatively unfree, with people behind the scenes pulling strings so that they get the people who are in power involved. And that is bad because it's probably going to lead to certain politicians siphoning off money and having it be hidden by the media. Is going to lead to probably exploitation of minority groups who the government does not like, who are trying to overthrow them. That stuff being covered by the media. All the harms that media perpetuates in dictatorial governments are more likely to happen if you, given this characterization, if you don't suppress them. And then you would probably need to show that international media providers are comparatively better than this. So obviously, it's a little bit difficult to show that you would get similar amounts of coverage, but you can show why there would still likely to be coverage. And you would explain why international media providers have an incentive to cover cases of emerging democracies, because the media that happens there is crucially important. People are very interested in how governments in a lot of these countries evolve, especially people who are within those countries. They have no ties to those governments, and those governments have no ability to have control over them. And you can solidify that analysis a little bit further by explaining, look, there are like two incentives of media, right? Or not two incentives, but their incentive is to get people to watch them and to be funded. And for domestic groups, they might literally be half funded by old monarchies or regimes or stuff like that, which means that they have to work in their interest to continue to get their money. But for international media providers, they go off of like legitimacy. They go off of many, many people believing that they're credible news sources, which means they will continue to be credible. They will continue to be accurate. And the news sources that they provide would be pretty good, right? And would be pretty good, pretty accurate, and pretty informative to people who would be living in those countries. So, for example, major scandals in the government likely wouldn't be covered up, and that comes at the cost of like some smaller news stories that you maybe would get, some smaller news stories that you would maybe would get in whatever country is the emerging democracy that you're using here. So that's what I think you should probably be running on government. I think the characterization is really important there. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's really good content feedback, which is really helpful for both myself and hopefully the viewers and audience listening. Yeah, that's all the thoughts I have for this motion.
All right, let's go on to round 5, the last in round. This House would take measures to reduce rural to urban migration. Measures may include, but are not limited to, tax reductions in rural areas, direct financial transfers, increased government spending / investment in rural areas, etc. So I believe I did watch your round on this one. What are your thoughts on this motion?
Let's see. I feel like I've seen variations of this motion before, but for the specific round, as you saw, we talked about gentrification to flip the... Oh wait, which side were we on?
You were CO, I think.
Oh, we were CO again. Oh, yeah, that's right. So yeah, we were CO, and we try to flip the Gov claims about why the communities left behind get worse by talking about gentrification, how when rich people move in, richer businesses move in, they raise the cost of living because they can afford things at a higher price. Briefly, we talked about the OG point where they said pollution in cities is really bad. That's probably a very simplified summary of the points, but our flip was that it's probably better for the environment people move to urban areas because of economies of scale, where several apartment units can share one energy heating system compared to rural areas having services and houses be more detached and spread apart. So there's more energy use per person. On our actual extension, I think we didn't actually have an explicit extension, we just had a bunch of analysis. So, yeah, in terms of refuting CG, which is also somewhat constructive analysis, CG says you'll lose important services, gives a, I think, better analyzed version of OG in some ways. And we try and mitigate this in the context of developed countries where we say, oftentimes people are aware it's really expensive to live in like downtown Toronto, for example. You have other reasons to not move, like emotional attachments to friends and family, or the fact that there's less job competition, so it's easier and more secure to get a job in your local rural region. The implication here was that you don't significantly hurt rural regions either, because they still mostly have services available. Even if you only have a few doctors, again, economies of scale, everyone can use the same hospital, use the same doctors. So you should rather weigh on the intensity of the benefits to the few individuals who do move and do get better job offers as well. The final thing we did in our extension was try and bring up a developing frame. I probably should have spent more time in this frame, but I think I got scared to lean hard into this extension because OG modeled this debate to be about just Canada.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if I could reframe this in this case, because from my perspective, I don't think you can narrow the debate to be about just one country, even if you have one fiat and OG, but I wasn't sure, so I cut some time out of it. And the industrialization in developing countries argument basically goes like, in developing countries, you oftentimes need urban migration to help do things like manufacture, to help improve industrialization. This is the most important thing for these nations at the moment, given that they have a lot of need for general economic growth and just to provide more products and services that are necessary for the quality of life for people on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think that assuming they don't, I actually, it's definitely tough to say if you can flip the model from CO, especially. I think at that point you might just want to go with it, but I think you can flip it. Might be a little bit risky, but I would say like it's not reasonable to limit it to this context. And the reason why I think that is because as a judge, modeling it to Canada actually just seems straight up incorrect. And the reason why is because rural to urban migration, it plateaus somewhere around 80-20. And it's been 80-20 in Canada for quite a bit. So that means you don't actually see that much rural to urban migration. The places that you do see this a lot are countries that are not 80-20 right now. So that would be countries like Nigeria, like China, like India, right? Where close to half, depending on the country, of the population still lives in rural areas. So I think that there is a lot more to say about those countries compared to Canada for sure, which is why I think you can maybe argue it. But definitely, like, if you put me in that spot, I would be confused as to what I'm able to do as well. I think opposition, especially opening opposition, should make it about those countries, especially because that's where it has the most effect. That's where it is probably most important and most beneficial for people to live in urban areas, because a lot of the time it actually does not get more expensive. It probably gets cheaper. It gets better for the environment for some of the reasons that you listed. So I think that especially if you're opposition, you want to put it in that frame. I think government should generally accept that frame too, though I don't know if they want to spend that much time giving that frame, because government's case definitely works better if you're just talking about, like, I don't know, going from Toronto to Oakville or Toronto to Barrie or whatever, right? Because that is you probably want to keep people living in Barrie, because living in Toronto has a lot of bad things that you can probably easily explain, like it being super expensive, like the pollution, like the, I don't know, stress of living in the city, whatever. There's a good amount that you can say on government. And that kind of ties into how I feel about like the motion balance here. I think this motion is probably not one that you want to run like this probably not that you want to run like this, because it is too easy to give arguments that are too strong and intuitive out of opening government. Like this result of 12 teams getting second out of 17 feels like that should not be the case. It feels like opening government should not this consistently be getting second. And they have like basically an average point distribution of 1.9, which is really, really skewed. So for that reason, I think probably find some kind of wording to make this a little bit more complicated or a little bit more difficult to see all the intuitive arguments out of government. Maybe like literally set it in developing countries, and then you would see, maybe literally just say this house would, in countries that have relatively high amounts of rural like population, pretty much, would take measures to reduce rural to urban migration. Because if you said it in Canada, there's just so little you can say on opposition to refute, like, oh, Toronto is really expensive, and Toronto, the cost of living is high, stuff like that, or same with Vancouver, or like any of the other major cities in Canada. So maybe set it like that, and I think you'd probably see something a lot more balanced than what you ended up seeing here.
One more comment about the wording of the motion specifically. I think another reason why this is advantageous to OG is that, like, the explicit mechanism in the motion of giving tax cuts, of giving financial transfers, just is already kind of good in and of itself towards helping vulnerable people. Like, whether or not you believe it's good for them to migrate or not, they can just say there's an explicit benefit to just giving them more financial support, given that they do tend to be underprivileged.
Oh, yeah. Right, yeah, I completely missed that part when looking at this the first time. But yeah, like, this motion can literally just be, this house would give tax reductions in rural areas. You would give direct financial transfers. You would increase government spending and investment in rural areas. Like, yeah, that makes too much sense. That's too easy. That's too good. That's why, yeah, that makes a lot of sense as to why it seems so good and so obvious to do from opening government, especially.
Yeah. Thankfully, our OG team didn't explicitly say that, but I think like they did mention to some extent the use of fiat, which probably stood given that they did take the second in our room.
Yeah, I will not understand that call, but I will not try to. Okay, cool.
Okay.
That's it for round 5. Let's go on to the quarters final round, which also was the which also was the junior semis for the tournament as well. The motion was this house would ban the installation of non-medical information technology, such as enhanced memory, enhanced perception, and distance communication within the human body. So, I'll say first of all that let's get your thoughts first on this. Which side did you debate? How did you think about this?
We were OG, like we have been for every single out round of my career ever. So yeah, in terms of broad thoughts on the motion, I think it's really up to interpretation because you just hint at the existence of really advanced technology, and this just gives teams the possibility to run away with like all sorts of speculation about what this technology can do, which is I think makes for oftentimes a messy debate. But I think it's quite interesting. Like you can just go straight up like sci-fi conspiracy theorist speculation. For our specific case on OG, yeah, the first thing we talked about is why there's a lack of accountability. And the reasons, first of all, the harms of the lack of accountability means corporations who have financial incentives can do things like perhaps like track your thoughts and your mental distance conversations on a very intimate level. For example, like if you're sad or depressed, if you've lost a family member, they can give you targeted advertising that preys upon your mental state. Or they can do more pernicious things like perhaps alter your perception or alter your memory in certain ways that benefits them, and we give a few speculative examples. And the mechanisms as to why there is difficult accountability that I think perhaps the teams should have engaged with in a more nuanced fashion, in my opinion, just to subtly say. But it was that it's often really, really subtle to know if something has gone wrong. So for example, if a corporation alters your memory, you have no way of holding them accountable because your memory has been altered, so you do not remember what you don't know.
Right, yeah, it's your memory.
Or it's like physically difficult. Like if it's a chip implanted in your brain, you can't like take it out on a whim and verify if it's stealing your data. And we give some analysis about why this is probably very complex technology. There's probably only a few experts or innovators in the field. They're going to be either concentrated in one company, or they're going to be like in just a few companies at the top who are like firstly very little in number and also have incentives to collude in cases of quote unquote corruption, because they all mutually benefit from a profit standpoint. I think that's refutable, but that's why it was sort of a preemption to any point on backlash that all the other teams sort of ran on. And just basic impacting, what this is bad, it violates your dignity and your right to privacy. Other teams was like, yes, you already lose privacy. This is also preempted because we talked about why the problem here wasn't the loss of privacy, but the fact that it was able to be taken away from you unconsensually without accountability. The second thing we talked about, which had some strategic flaws in the way we built the case, I wouldn't say flaws, but some things that should have been cleared up, was the idea of why this is firstly coercive and secondly perpetuates wealth inequality. And the way we built this case was that this gives you benefits to productivity in a capitalistic system. You have better memory, you have better learning skills probably, and this means it's more attractive to employers, and people who need jobs to survive, who are competing against each other to get these jobs, are therefore coerced into changing their like identity or their biology on a very physical and intimate level in order to survive in this competitive environment. And we thought this was an unjust mechanism of coercion, given how deeply and intimately it changed you. The second thing we said was this kind of a stock point about why this perpetuates wealth inequality, why lower income individuals aren't able to access this wealth. There was some comparative analysis about why some people who are from lower income backgrounds, although have structural disadvantages, are really, really naturally smart or really, really naturally talented, which allows some individuals to have social mobility because they can compete with people with more opportunities. But now they can't even do that because the biological gaps widen as well, which further disadvantages them. The reason I think this was only pointed out on OpWhip, which was that if this is really coercive, the fact that it is coercive suggests that this technology is widely available in order for it to be coercive. So it's then hard to believe that this is only accessible for like really, really elite people. I think the nuance that we should have pointed out in the case is that it's not about just being concentrated at the top. It's just about being specifically inaccessible to the people at the bottom. So you can have both impacts.
Right, yeah. So it depends on, and there's also, I think, probably work like that. I think the argument there is fine. It's just you need to be ready for opposition to explain why it would likely be accessible, right? Because technology, innovation, competition, stuff like that, profit motives, right? But yeah, I think that was generally the standard case that I saw in my room too on opening government, and that kind of persisted throughout the round. I think that's probably one of the better cases you can run on Gov. I think the more interesting discussion is on opposition. So what did you like out of opposition between either your opening or closing that you saw?
Okay, so I think out of OO, a lot of the case is quite good, although they center around the medical applications, but the motion specifies non-medical information technology.
Right.
Perhaps it is applicable in some circumstances, I'm not sure. But I guess like what I liked out of them is just firstly talking about the black market, which I think is pretty stock,
The
but
black
it was
market?
done.
Oh, I
Yeah,
didn't
it
even
was
think
done
of that.
reasonably well. I would say.
Uh-huh. Wait, black market as in like people would black market install chips into their head?
Yeah, the argument is that like this would be done outside of like legal supervision because there was need
Oh.
for this. Perhaps people who really, really want to enhance their memory and prevent things like dementia, which is, quite tragic for a lot of families. So what this would do is it would create this sort of black market, which made it harder to regulate. This isn't super comparative because we already prove it's hard to regulate, but like I think the analysis about it in terms of why regulation is better than complete bans is stock, but really decently well done, I would say.
Right, yeah, that's super cool. I didn't even think I think that you can actually run that in a fairly convincing way by just saying like, look, the motion just bans the installation of non-medical technology, and it doesn't ban the research of it. And a lot of those things are probably interchangeable. So for example, if you've gone partially blind, you might need enhanced perception in your eyes as a chip that you could install, or like something you can install in your eye maybe, right? Or if you need enhanced memory or enhanced cognitive function to account for some kind of disability or dementia or Alzheimer's, the research and the technology would still all be there. It's just not allowed to be installed in people for non-medical reasons. But if those things all exist, there's going to be some shady doctor who wants their kids to be really smart, or who knows rich people who want themselves to be really smart or have better memory or have less fatigue or whatever, which reasonably could get it very accessible on the black market because the technology would already exist. It would already exist and already be tested on people just only for medical purposes.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
That's also interesting, just the final note. This didn't happen in my round, but I feel like it would have been interesting if one of the op teams challenged whether or not we would support this being used medically. And perhaps they can draw parallels that like wash some of our premises in terms of like coercion, where diseases are quite quote unquote coercive in terms of affecting the way you make decisions. Perhaps the same issues with consent would apply, although I think we can argue some.
Obviously, you would say yes, right? Obviously, you'd be fine with
We would
this
say yes,
medically,
but
right?
yeah.
Yeah, you would say
It would,
yes.
it would be a challenge in terms of proving the difference or the uniqueness of why this is non-medical technology and why our analysis still stands.
I think almost all of it still stands. Like the equality stuff still stands. The coerciveness still stands, right? Like if you're sick, you're coerced into taking medicine, right? Like you don't like no one's coercing you, but like you have a very large reason to want to take medicine, or like if you have cancer, you have a very large reason to want to take chemotherapy, right? So I think you can probably just draw the parallel there, and then all your arguments stay consistent, I think.
Yeah, that's fair. That's true.
Okay. Let me know if you heard this in your round. But what I think is probably a pretty good and strong op case is a case about straight up why cyborgs do jobs better and why that's very utile. So like I have two examples here. One, let's say you are a doctor. Doctors have a big problem right now of not knowing people's whole medical history because you can't know everyone's full medical history just by looking at a file, by looking at it, right? Because your connection to the file is too slow. You can't read it and memorize it as fast enough, right? And the second thing is they don't know how all drugs interact with all other drugs. And that's a very complicated kind of database that you would need to look for when prescribing. And as a result, I think the number is something like upwards of 100,000 people get seriously injured or die as a result of doctor misprescription, at least in the US alone, which means that there is a big need to give doctors more ability to process information and have memory. What this does is you can install chips into doctors. You can have doctors install chips into themselves. They would have better memory and enhanced perception, so they could read and take in a medical history much faster. They can memorize how every drug interacts with every other drug, which is something that we're pretty close to getting with computers right now. So in a world where this exists, they probably have that too. And they would be able to not misprescribe people medicine. They would be able to know everyone's full medical history. They would probably be able to work longer hours with less fatigue, with some kind of fatigue chip or whatever. And they'd be able to not get as tired, which means they're not going to make as many mistakes if you're like prescribing people things, or you're doing a surgery or anything like that. All those things would become significantly better, which means that less people die, you're able to serve people better, you can serve more people, you ensure that there's probably a faster system where people don't have to wait so long, which means that people go in more to get preventative care, to figure out problems ahead of time, get more screening and stuff like that. All of these things you could do much better and much more quickly. And then the second example here is, let's say you're like a construction worker, right? Being a construction worker is really dangerous. Something can fall on your foot, you can step on a rusty nail, you can get something swung onto your face, you can have something dropped on you and not realize. All of these things are really big deals, and like it's really bad for people to die as a result of their work because they don't really have another choice, right? And being able to have this technology be installed into people means that, and also all of these problems are exacerbated at night, right? Because a lot of construction has to happen at night because of like noise, and people are using the roads during the day, stuff like that. And people are using buildings during the day. And so probably give people night vision. You can probably allow people to have better perception of their surroundings. So if they see something dangerous on the ground, they won't step on it. If they like notice, I don't know, they feel a change in air pressure or like sound of something falling on them, they can see it and react more quickly. You can use a bunch of biological, physical enhancement to make it much cheaper, or not much cheaper, much less dangerous for them to work. You can allow them to work better, non-fatigue, stuff like that, which makes them more productive, and they can get more useful infrastructure made, and they can do it more quickly and probably for more cheaply as well. And then the last thing to tie that case all together is to say that this will be accessible to almost everyone in the company that works there for the jobs that need it, because the companies have an incentive to do so. Every person that gets hurt by a doctor can literally sue for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they usually win because usually the doctor messed up, right? Or every construction worker that loses a hand or an arm or sight or their ears or whatever, or their hearing, as a result of a workplace injury, gets compensated a lot of money. They get salary for life. They get disability. Their insurance has to pay out, right? So there's a very, very large incentive to want to give these people the technology. So even if it was $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 to install in a person, it would still be worth it for the company, because like you pay them 50, 60, 70,000 for construction workers, probably more, and then like probably double or triple that for doctors as well. So they are worth a lot. Making them more productive is worth a lot. Preventing lawsuits and disability claims and insurance claims is worth a lot. So you're going to have a society where people in their work can be much more safe while doing it. They can provide much better services. They can do a lot more of it, which means we get closer to being able to provide everything that they need in society. You can sing Kumbaya and be happy and have a wonderful world. But that's how I think a strong version of the op case can go, especially with how much leeway and creativity you're given by how the motion is specifically worded.
That's really interesting, and this didn't really come up in my round in the specific way you've explained it. But one of the teams, I think it might have been closing op, did talk about productivity. And I think this is a broad comment about debate in general, because I think the problem with the way productivity was run in our debate was that it wasn't impacted or illustrated as well. And this is a unique case where illustrations aren't just good for like being persuasive to the judge, but also in terms of grounding your impacts.
Yeah.
Because when you just say productivity in a vacuum, it's really hard to weigh, especially against like more tangible impacts given by other teams, which I think made it harder for it to be credited in the way it was ran in our round, given that it was under illustrated.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, it's the productivity argument, except productivity is just a word. That's not an impact, right? Like, people being able to work at night and work for longer hours to build more things, to be able to get more shelters up, more apartments up so that the housing doesn't go off the roof, right? There's a lot of very specific things that you can do. I think you're exactly right to point out that the illustrations here are really useful for grounding impacts, but also grounding your analysis, right? Like, if you're thinking about how to increase productivity in general, right? Like you could say maybe people can work longer hours, not get as tired, right? But in terms of how specifically they can do it, you just can't analyze it on a general level. You have to look to certain professions and use those as your baseline for analyzing how you become more productive, right? Doctors don't have to spend as long filing things away. They don't have to be as scared of providing the wrong medicine because they have all the information they need. Construction workers don't have to worry about as much danger because they have more ability to avoid it. All things like that make your analysis much, much stronger as a result.
Definitely.
Any other final thoughts?
Actually, yeah, just one last thing. In terms of what you were saying, I was thinking about your analysis while you were giving it.
Yep.
And I think there's a really interesting flip to the principle. It's not a precise flip, but like what you can say is, in terms of coercion, people are coerced into jobs on either sides of the house. At least on our side, if they're equally coerced, at least they're safer doing it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good flip.
It's good for like defeating the weighing, because I think it's easy to weigh principles, less easy in BP, but easier in worlds. But you can weigh principles and be like, oh, even if there's practical benefits, it's more important to weigh coercion because it affects your ability to rationally consent, this sort of weighing. And yeah, I just think that the principle flip is quite interesting.
Yeah, that is a very worlds thing to point out, but very, very interesting nonetheless. Okay, let's go on to the next one. For the semifinals, there's an info slide. A community veto is a referendum voted on by members of a geographical community or neighborhood that, if a majority so votes, would block any proposed infrastructure or building project in/passing through that community. The motion is, this house prefers a world with community vetoes. So, this is the round that, well, you can talk about the round first of all.
Okay, shout out to Leo and Alex for popping off and opening opposition and definitely burning the turf. So there was not a lot of content to talk about on. Wait, were they closing off? Yeah, they were closing off. They were opening off. We were closing off.
Yeah.
They definitely turf burned us pretty hard. Yet somehow we made it through. You know, Joseph, I think you disagreed, but I'm just glad we made it through.
Yeah, like, okay, I watched the round and I thought this does not serve. So, okay, so I'll explain my thought process here because I fully believe you two debated better than opening government. Like, you had better fundamentals, right? Or maybe not debated better, but like your fundamentals were better. However, I thought that opening government achieved some stuff about being able to protect a minority of people and why they're particularly important and why this is a harm that you are likely to incur on people if you don't have community vetoes. I think that opening opposition did a very good job of wrecking opening government. I thought it wasn't thorough enough to reduce all of it, and that's what I weigh against the closing opposition case, which had new analysis, but I thought didn't serve much of a new function in the debate. So I've heard this in like feedback given to me in like rounds that I've debated, right? Your analysis can actually, even if it's a different mechanism, if it does the exact same thing and has relatively similar impacts, unless if I was unsure about how a certain consequence would happen out of opening opposition, the closing opposition thing that they say is not super useful in terms of contribution. Now, I think you probably had good enough responses and also weighing that was new out of opening opposition that probably put you guys over opening government, which if I looked at my flow more closely, probably I believe that OG got even more wrecked than I thought, which means that you guys should have made it through over them. I'm not even, like, at this point, that's kind of how I saw it. But you can talk about what actually happened out of OO, and then how that took everything out of what you wanted to say on CO.
Sure. I'll chat about the round briefly and about why I think our case has strategic advantages over OO, and I didn't get the RFD, but why I think we probably passed. So OG firstly talked about the principle of democracy. They say that these are often policies that deeply affect the lives of these individuals. They should have a right to, have some say over them. And then secondly, they talk about cases in which this change is really, really bad and is forced upon them, such as, for example, like pipelines or perhaps factories that really harm the quality of life of people in the area. And oftentimes why they get passed because of lobbying. I think O points out that a lot of their case is symmetric by proving that by just observing there's local governments as well who get voted in, and why they have incentives to not do things that are, incredibly disastrous, given it's bad for their campaign. I think they had a lot of nuance here in terms of the incentives of voters that I don't think I remember well enough to summarize here. And Alex gives the lobbying response for probably, I think, the third or fourth time this tournament about why lobbying is only beneficial insofar as it funds your campaign advertising. Politicians predominantly care about voting or votes from citizens and why that's going to be prioritized. That he stole my response in closing opposition. I was hoping we could sneak in that as a new response. And then he talks about why the principle isn't incredibly important, given we oftentimes already allocate political responsibilities to people we don't vote for. Oh, and then he talks about why there's good infrastructure that what is going to get blocked, and it mechanizes it pretty well.
A pretty good case.
Yeah, in terms of being on closing opposition, so I think it should be observed that it was quite hard because they did a very good job of not only refuting opening government, so there's no quote-unquote deadlocks to break, and they also had a good and well-mechanized case. But I think what we uniquely did on closing up, and I'll just talk about the case and what I think was new chronologically. This was less important, but we had a few possibly new responses to opening governments that maybe were not that useful because I think opening up is solidly ahead. In terms of democracy, I think opening up only refutes democracy very flippantly through intuition pumping by saying, oh, bureaucrats exist, we don't vote for bureaucrats. We spend more time in terms of refuting democracy by talking about why the obligation only exists based on the social contract and why this only manifests as a practical obligation to enshrine our rights, and observing that even with referenda, you don't really get full representation of the principle, because if the vote is, for example, 90% to 10%, your specific vote as an individual was not the tipping point to create change, so it wasn't really important, or it wasn't really represented in a way. And I think this just overall serves to analyze why democracy exists on a sliding scale. It is not an absolute obligation, which perhaps is a more nuanced take than opening up, although I'm not sure how necessary it was. But I think broadly, in terms of the constructive extension, we were trying to prove why good policies that improved things like housing accessibility were uniquely the ones that were going to be blocked, and why this is better on the counterfactual. And the analysis here was the places with the most need for accessibility tend to be the places with the least capacity to win these policies in referenda, because the demographics tend to be mostly rich people. And the context here is like, if you really need accessibility, this suggests housing is scarce, housing is really expensive, and therefore the people who are living there tend to be predominantly rich. What this means is that given the demographics, it's hard to pass referenda, because if you're voting specifically on this issue, you're probably going to lose because most people are rich people. They're NIMBYs. They don't like driving down their property value by increasing housing supply. The comparative that we proved is oftentimes these municipal governments, or campaigners, have a plurality of issues that they campaign on. So when all of these things are grouped into one campaign, people who might not specifically like the accessibility policy might like one of their other policies, and there's a unique change created in terms of the people who are voting for these policies, and that's why it comparatively gets better on our side when you can pass these policies by proxy of people liking the other policies of these politicians. And the reason I think that I pointed out in my speech as to why we perceive this as strategically important, or I guess how we try to make it strategically important, is by saying, given the context that we provided as to why these demographics are mostly rich, it's unclear on opening opposition how they get comparative benefits even if they have local governments, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this proves why there is comparative change and why we can actually pass good policy on our side of the house, not just offensive content, symmetrizing or taking down opening government. So yeah, that's like our conception of what was important out of our case.
Yeah, you know what? I think you pointed out, like listening back to it seems honestly really good, really strategic. I didn't catch all of that. Like, I was listening really closely and I didn't see all the strategic value, but like obviously it helps for you to sit here and like explain what the strategic value of each of these things were. It is actually probably what should come up more in the whip speech as well, as to what the strategic value is, which I think you would do a really good job of like whipping your own case here. But yeah, I think the case is actually really smart, which I can see more of the value now. So for anything I said about like this is a loss, I'm glad you didn't lose, because that actually seems very good. And I think that probably panels like discussing through it would realize there are a lot of actually useful contributions in your case.
One tangential observation that like I just thought of
Hmm?
is in terms of whipping my own cases. I used to actually really do this in extension where I would have one specific unique thing, and I would just spend like 2 minutes just explaining or weighing the value of it in extension.
Hmm?
But like my style sort of changed in terms of I noticed in this tournament I did a lot less of strategic differentiation, which I think defined most of my extensions when I first started debating,
Hmm?
and is more about like trying to win on a bunch of different paths, trying to create a bunch of different paths to victory and being more about content dumping, which I think
Yeah.
you probably also noticed.
Content. Yeah, no, I'm just like looking at this and like all of your speeches that I watch had like 3 or 4 different things that you're trying to win on all at once. And I'm like, they're all explained pretty well. I think some of it is cut a little bit thin or a little bit short because you're doing that. But if something lands, like there's a good chance you're not going for, right? Like if you go all in on something and then you don't explain it properly, then that's a 4, right?
Mhm.
Especially as people get better. But if you have many different aspects that you're, and one of them you're probably winning on, because if you're focusing on all of them relatively evenly, which you generally do, there's a good chance you can have some reason for one of the judges to say, oh, that's probably a 2, that's probably a 1, or they just like win a decent amount on all of them, therefore they win the whole debate, right?
I think it's just interesting how my style did a complete 180 over
Yeah.
the course of 2 years.
I think it's also quite different than how most other people do extensions as well. I think it's not completely different, but it's like kind of a sliding scale, and you're pretty far on the end of like you're saying a lot of you're dumping a lot of good and new useful content that has strategic value.
Mhm.
All right, cool. So that was the semifinals, and then the grand final motion, which was thought very. It was stock, but I liked watching that debate a lot. I think it's one of the coolest debates I've seen so far, even as like a relatively stock motion. The motion was, this house prefers the use of a lottery system for admitting students to university for all students that meet a minimum academic threshold. So that was the motion. Spoilers, the team that ended up winning was opening government, as I might have revealed before. But what were your thoughts on the round, having debated in it?
I think in terms of our personal case, one of the strategic mistakes was that we tunneled quite hard on the metric of like individuals, their fulfillment, and their happiness. I think the stock O case looks a lot more like just talking about the practical values to society. I know I complained about this a lot to you in terms of what we regretted doing, and we had a case on research and why research is better and more innovative when talent is concentrated, and also could have just like done a lot more impacting as to why it's beneficial that we get better students alongside talking about why it's good for these students. They're saying things like better qualified people to serve others in society, more doctors to save lives, these sorts of things. But we tunneled quite hard on individual fulfillments, which probably was, I think it was a mistake. In terms of the round as a whole, I think the round overall was really interesting because all teams had unique things to say. And back half talked a lot more about the schools themselves as an institution, whereas front half talked a lot more about the individuals, which is an interesting observation to make. And the last thing was OG ran the stock, well, not the stock, but like the intuitive principle of unfairness and inequality of opportunities quite interestingly. I think you had different thoughts on the principle than I did, along with a lot of the other judges. But like, the first part is the basic stuff about why people are born into different places. They have different opportunities because of their socioeconomic background. And then they start talking about, I think Leo in the later half of the principle talks about why some people are more biologically predisposed to working hard. Some people are more biologically talented. So it was sort of a determinism argument, which I thought was old and very interesting. And I might have thought it was too interesting because I spent 45 seconds dealing with it independently. But yeah.
Yeah, no, this is a classic. If you've been through debate coaching, you will have learned about the veil of ignorance, and you'll have learned about we are all like all these things are arbitrary, and they're arbitrary because you don't determine any of these things. And I think it works pretty well here, right? Because the strongest, most intuitive arguments on opposition are about why people who work harder deserve the benefits, right? And why we have a system currently that rewards hard work and that also rewards like having wealth, but it's actively attempting to not be the case that they're awarding wealth and opportunities and rather awarding hard work, but it still exists there, right? So this does 2 things to remedy a problem that is an unfair system that exists right now. So I think it actually has a lot of value in that case that I actually didn't see when thinking about the value of that argument from yesterday.
Yeah. I can talk about how we attempted to engage with the principal, then perhaps you can like summarize your thoughts on it, because I know you said some really smart stuff about why this is like it's not an active principle in a lot of ways, and why it's
Yeah.
sort of yeah.
Yeah, sure.
So the way we interpreted it was we perceived it as an active principle about why there was an obligation to correct this unfairness. So what we said was we firstly tried to do some mitigation by pointing out, like, even if people have different opportunities, they have different jumping off platforms, but a lot of it is based on individual merit in terms of how much you study, how much you do extracurriculars. So while there's a degree of unfairness, there's also a degree of autonomy involved in terms of the success of students. So what we said was that we didn't need to have a blanket lottery to rectify marginal, well, not marginal, but like partial injustice. We could just have existing systems to rectify this inequality. For example, the fact that admission officers evaluate your portfolio in the context of your economic circumstances. So one example is they don't necessarily look at the total number of APs you take, but rather how many were available to you in your school, whether or not like they were just available in your local region, if you had IB programs in your school offered to you, these sorts of things. So a lot of it is contextually based. There's also things like essays acting as a countervailing mechanism about why this is also accessible to lower income students who have unique experiences, and just some stuff about why universities try and have a balanced class, so they have geographic and economic diversity as well. So some students who perhaps come from less competitive or perhaps poorer regions get some benefits in terms of the application system. Even if this doesn't completely rectify inequality, the fact that there is some merit involved in terms of applications, and the inequality is only somewhat marginal in terms of the application process, means that it is sufficient to correct the principled injustice. Oh, and in terms of their determinism argument, their argument is that there are biological differences, so we shouldn't reward people who work harder because it wasn't their free choice, because they were more biologically predisposed to it. We couldn't really think of a structural way to refute this. We just gave an intuition pump and said, I think I said, this also goes the other way, like probably they would still defend prosecuting criminals, even if perhaps some people were more committed or more predisposed to committing crime biologically. We would still hold them accountable because we believe in free choice. I don't think this was incredibly important to the debate on either side, but yeah, that was the response to the second half of the principle.
Yeah, from the way that part specifically was talked about, it wasn't clear enough how exactly that takes down the argument, because there's a few links you have to make there, I think. And then what I'll say to the principled argument on my thoughts on it, I think that there's a good way that you can reframe the value of their argument in a way that makes it not so strong, right? That actually makes them do a little bit more work. So sure, let's say at the best case they show that there are injustices right now and we make it more fair. However, all they're really doing is moving where so right now there is a coin flip basically from where you were born that determines how well your life goes, right? And what kind of riches and goods you get. On their side, you have basically a coin flip at the point in which you are entering for a university, right? So there is going to be a coin flip no matter what, right? And some people are going to be arbitrarily picked over other people, and I think the justification they gave for why it's better to have the coin flip be done earlier doesn't actually explain why it is more just to do it like that, just that it is not any less just to make that the coin flip. I think what you can then say is, so there's like probably some that still is standing out of that, but then what you can say is, if you lean into the research kind of stuff or the better society kind of stuff, this is kind of the classic philosophical defense for allowing inequality as well, is that even if there is inequality, you're able to make people who are the worst off in society or the poorest off in society better as a result of allowing the most talented and rich and hardworking students into universities. And the reason, maybe not rich, but like talented and hardworking, because they're the ones who are more likely to be able to leverage and take advantage of the opportunities they are given, which means that they can either become, they're more likely to become successful doctors, they're more likely to become successful, I don't know, social workers, they're more likely to become successful in the careers that they go into, or like scientists or researchers who can all produce benefits that make even the worst of the worst in society off, right? So they can do things like, I don't know, invent better agricultural practices, which means that people in a lot of countries around the world can now grow food more efficiently. They can grow food with less water. That probably saves hundreds of thousands of lives. They can develop better solutions towards extreme poverty, work on developing specific systems that can help lift people out of poverty. That includes like mosquito nets and like high yield crop seeds, and organizing a whole program to put all these things together. These are things that are very, very difficult to do, that provide benefit to people who are the least fortunate off in society. And those are the things that allow the justification for this inequality or this unfairness to exist, because there are going to be people, you're going to be able to help society as a whole from allocating the most resources towards people who can be the most productive with them.
Yeah. Unfortunately for us, I ran out of time for the third argument, so even though I roadmapped it, I did have to drop it, so this weighing did not come out in the round. But I think it's a really smart way of weighing on the practical to defeat any principle that comes out of government in general.
Right, yeah. And but yeah, your partner also roadmapped it too. And then didn't say anything about it.
Damn.
Yeah,
that's kind of tragic.
That is mighty tragic. I don't know how close the call was. It seemed like Charlie would have been pretty close. So let's not wallow in regrets there. But yeah, any other thoughts on this round? I'll briefly talk about actually the CG and the CO for anyone who didn't get to watch it. CG basically argued that that the world, so a good 2/3 of their case was about how people are less happy taking debate classes or Model UN and DECA because that's soul crushing. Very funny. I love that part of the speech, but a little bit derivative because OG had good analysis on that. And then the second part, which I thought was a stronger part, was about how people become, or how jobs in their selection and how society becomes much more fair. So the parts that I thought were really good were the parts where CG analyzed why companies are less likely to emphasize where you go for university, and they're less likely to emphasize the existence of university at all, because some people probably just don't get into any of their universities, right? And they just move on and they start working. So there will probably become more of an emphasis on your actual skills, your actual like interview skills, abilities, your portfolio, whatever, things that are probably easier to access than university, and are probably more productive as the metrics in which you would use to hire people. And that, for reasons that were weakly explained out of CG, reduces the amount of inequality in society and probably makes society more productive as a result. Yeah, and then that was the main part. And the second part that they talked about was like how the de-emphasis on university probably allows you to prioritize other things that make you happy as well, right? So you become happier focusing on your relationships, you become happier focusing on your hobbies, not having to join in on the rat race overall, the rat race to university, which probably can make you happier, especially as a younger person. And then for CO, they talked about, they probably had the best responses in the round to the minorities will get more representation, which is that they are minorities, right? And if you're coin flipping, they're still going to lose out most of the time, right? They might actually lose out more than they do right now, because in a lot of places there exists affirmative action for people who are part of ethnic minorities or disprivileged backgrounds, right? So that's the first thing. They added a few other things to their case, which I have actually written down here, but basically why they added some analysis about why they'd be able to research things better, why they'd be able to why people would be able to generally live out better lives, get better jobs as a result of being able to go to a more fitting university that caters to what your needs and what your demands are as an individual student better. Those were left a little bit vague, which could have helped their case, but generally pretty strong, pretty well reasoned case there. What I will say lastly, which we got in feedback from Josh Cohen, which both me and Liz thought were very good, was focusing on the part where it says meet a minimum academic threshold, right? So firstly, is it a minimum across all universities? Is it a minimum for that specific university? If you're comparing it to how it works right now, a lot of, especially Canadian schools, just say you have, for this program, you meet this minimum academic threshold, and then we decide whether or not we want to admit you or not. Are you going to get admitted? It's actually kind of a dice roll. For most programs at least. So if that is what you're trying to apply everywhere, and you have really prestigious schools like Harvard or Yale or whatever, they're likely to want to maintain their prestige in government's world, which means that they're likely to set these academic thresholds extremely high, like think 98, 99% averages in high school. And what that means is that your life is going to be focused on getting grades, which is a lot more boring than focusing on extracurriculars. It's a lot less equal compared to extracurriculars. Some schools just give you better grades because they're rich and they can afford to do so, and because they have a reputation to want to allow people to get into the best university. So that is a system that becomes a lot worse. That's kind of the starting case that's kind of the starting point for the other kind of framing that you can take on the motion, which focuses a lot more on how this is bad to put a minimum threshold on a lottery system rather than the kind of holistic process that we have right now, at least in the United States.
Yeah. Shout out to Josh. Like when he said that was like mind blowing.
Yeah.
That was massive ring.
He's like, I work in admissions offices right now, and this is what you need to focus on. And it made a lot of sense. It was very good.
It also defeats the OG principle because like there's still inequalities in access to education.
Yeah, exactly. It completely destroys the OG principle. Like it blows them out of the water. Like the argument does not work at all if you have this other metric, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they got away with that one. This is the last one that got away.
Unlucky. Oh, also, last thing, shout out to Claire. At some point in her speech, she was like, playing League of Legends can be fulfilling. Probably made a lot of gamers happy.
Jin hinted at it, and then Claire finished it. It was a really fun speech to listen to. It's also pretty well reasoned and pretty well analyzed from
Mm-hmm.
It was a really fun round to watch. Alrighty, so that brings us to the end of the motion segments and to our conclusion for this first episode of BTT. Any finishing thoughts on either of any of the motions or anything we talked about today?
Not particularly. I just thought it was a really fun tournament. It was a roller coaster of emotions, but I thought it was quite well organized. The judging was all like stellar, at least from the judges I experienced. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it was lovely to debate there, and it was lovely to be here today.
Yeah, it was really fun to watch, really fun to coach a bunch of people in that tournament. It was really enjoyable for me to go to and like spectate all the rounds. They were really nice about it. All right, so the last thing I'll note about this tournament is I'm fairly certain that this was the last tournament of this competitive year because it is August 20th. The tournament was August 20th to the 21st, which means that next tournament you are going to see the start of the next season of debate, which will be very, very exciting. I don't know when the next tournament is. Wait, Enviro is next week, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
That is still this year's tournament, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so do you know the team count for that one?
Nope. I'm not involved, but of course I can probably send you some details after.
Oh, okay, yeah. So it's like a smaller tournament. Look out for that. I don't know if Reg is still open or probably not. I don't know. But this is probably the last major of this competitive. So yeah, looking forward to the competitive season next year. We'll probably run some kind of podcast talking about it in the future about what is happening in the next competitive year. If you're looking for the tournaments and the brief breakdown on what the tournaments are going to be for next year, there is a Cusid tourney list that includes high school. I'll probably include them in the description or the show notes for today. But yeah, that's everything for us today. Thank you so much, Liz, for coming on today. It's been a pleasure talking about all the motions, talking about debate with you. Any shout outs you want to have?
Yeah, shout out to Andrew, my lovely partner, and for playing Tetris with me in between the rounds. It was a vibe.
Nice, perfect. Alrighty, so that is it for today. Hope you guys enjoyed listening. Give me any feedback in the comments or any reviews. That would be much appreciated. And hopefully we will see you next time, either in a week or two. Yeah, this has been Joseph.
Elizabeth.
Signing off.